Hi again. We're in Three Worlds, Plan of Redemption, page 87. Barbour has been discussing the subhead of this chapter is two covenants, or Jewish and gospel dispensations. In those days they found a chronological parallel, a shadow Israel and a spiritual Israel, which of course the witnesses still hold, but without the advantage of this chronological parallelism, which he gets into more here. These things being true, is it strange that God has carried these parallels a little further, and that the measure of the two should be also equal? That there is no direct measurement of the gospel age between the lids of the Bible, we are fully convinced. In fact, the gospel dispensation is thrown in, as it were, in a parenthesis, as if the children of the flesh, having failed, everything in the regular order of events had stopped until this wonderful process of developing a seed on a higher plane should be accomplished. Prophecy in the Old Testament never speaks of two advents of Christ, and almost always, if not invariably, associates the works of the first and the second together, as if they were one and the same. And he references Isaiah 9 verse 10. For unto us a child is born, and unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, etc. Where in that can the first advent to suffer, and the second advent to reign, and the long years between the two be distinguished? Read Luke 1:31-33. Thou shalt call his name Jesus, and he shall be great, and shall reign over the house of Jacob forever. Where could Mary see the whole gospel dispensation between the beginning and end of that sentence? And he asks us to compare also Isaiah 61, the passage that Christ read in the synagogue in Luke 4, and Luke 4 verse 19, where it's referenced, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God. At the word "and" between Lord and thee in the above prophecy, the gospel parenthesis comes in. It's a good point. And then he references Zechariah 9 and 10, where you have the same joining together of the advents into one picture. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the ass. He speaks peace to the heathen, and his dominion is from sea to sea, all of which, except the riding into Jerusalem, belongs to the restitution age, i.e. the second advent. From the above, many suppose that the reckoning of time stopped between the two advents, so far as prophecy is concerned. Hence they feel at liberty to place the last week of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9 somewhere in the future, while admitting that 69 of these weeks ended at the coming of Messiah the Prince, when he came to his own after the preaching of John, and count the gospel age a blank, and connect the other week with the second advent. But although events found in close connection in prophecy may be in the fulfillment wide apart, time never ceases, either in prophecy or otherwise. In this, I must add that he's at odds with most of the prophetic interpreters in the premillennial camp. He goes on, the gospel church is referred to in prophecy, if at all, only in types and dark sayings, and all the prophecies concerning the work of the first and the second advent would read just as smoothly if the restitution age, when Christ takes the kingdom and reigns, had followed the Jewish age without the introduction of a gospel dispensation. God has certainly promised a restitution and a glorious future to Israel in the flesh. And it is only in the New Testament we learn that these same prophecies are also to be fulfilled in a higher sense, to spiritual Israel. So we notice he's got Barbour and Russell both had a literal Israel and a spiritual Israel, not either or. For the children of the promise are counted for the seed, and the children of the bondwoman shall not be heirs with the children of the free woman. Nevertheless, there are great promises in store for them, because, like Ishmael, they are the seed of Abraham. And I would say here, Barbour and Russell are far ahead of their spiritual descendants, Jehovah's Witnesses. It is between the casting off of fleshly Israel and their restoration that the gospel dispensation to the Gentiles, to take out from them a people for his name, comes in. I would not have you to be ignorant of this mystery, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And here, during the period in which they were to be cast off, is where we find the measure of the gospel age. For blindness cannot be turned away from them until the gospel to the Gentiles shall end. When they have received double for all their sins, their appointed time will be accomplished and their iniquity pardoned. Double means 2 equal parts, and if God has thus divided their chastisement so that the 2 parts are distinctly marked, and we can find the measure of the first part, of course the length of the other half will be determined. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare, in the margin it says appointed time, is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received at the Lord's hand double for all her sins. This is Isaiah 40 verse 2. From the beginning of their history until the coming of Shiloh or Christ, they held a peculiar relation to God. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. During the time Christ was in the loins of Judah, their relation to God remained unchanged, although they were continually being chastised. But when Christ had come, offered himself to fleshly Israel, and was rejected, and put to death in the flesh, they lost that relationship, since which he has been taking out a people for his name by a new process, begotten and born of the Spirit, and not of the flesh, nor of the will of man. And Israel in the flesh has been utterly forsaken of God, and their house left unto them desolate. This was certainly the turning point in their history, for from that day to this, their relationship to God has remained unacknowledged, and they left to their blindness until the fullness of the Gentiles become in. The idea may be a little startling, but in the spring of 1878, a point in their history will be reached when this latter half will be just equal to the former. Let's keep in mind that this book is written and published in 1877, so it was a few months away at this point. The spring of 1878, a point in their history will be reached when this latter half, that is suffering or chastisement, will be just equal to the former. In other words, the measure of the period during which they held a peculiar relationship to God, and the measure of this time during which they have been utterly cast off will be equal. Double means 2 equal parts, and in the spring of 1878 they will have received double for all their sins. Will not the comforting message then go forth, and the work of their restitution commence? So if you read Russell and Rutherford's works subsequent to the separation from Barbour, you realize Russell carried this right on, and so did Rutherford. The idea being that in 1878 something had happened invisibly, and that was the kingdom came in heaven, and Israel's sins were paid for, and thereafter, 1878, Israel would start to be restored. So when Zionism kicked off in the 1890s, of course, Russell felt vindicated. And that thought went on right into the Rutherford era, that all of the things that were happening, Jerusalem being recaptured by Allenby in the First World War, etc., were all fulfilling biblical prophecy. So it all looked good at that point, but of course within a decade Rutherford had abandoned the belief that Israel had any part in God's purpose. I'll put a link into another series we did on Humpty Dumpty, this one called A History of Humpty, a history of Bible misinterpretation.